8. Sexual difference. Introductory remarks, mutual misrecognition. In choreographers, Derrida formulates the question of as follows: must one think difference before taking off from it? 1. This question immediately lends itself to two equally misconstrued answers, related to how one determines both sexual difference and difference on the one hand. Lacanians make the claim that one must think difference as taking off from. However, this claim presupposes an understanding of as real, traumatic, and by no means, therefore, subject to a formal binary determination. As Vis-a vis puts it, if may be said to be formal, it is certainly a strange form, a form whose main result is precisely that it undermines every universal form which attempts to capture it. Far from constraining the variety of sexual arrangements in advance, the real of is the traumatic cause which sets their contingent proliferation in motion too. If one does not recognize this complexity, it becomes easy to mistake the Lacanian claim concerning the priority of over-difference for an argument that all concrete variations of sexual life are constrained by an implicit, pseudo-transcendental, normative condition of binary, or what Judith Butler calls ideal gender. Dimorphism 3. It is in consequence of this mistake, Vis-a-vis argues, that Butler imposes on Lacan the view that social life is based in fictive and idealized kinship positions that presume 237 the heterosexual family as constituting the defining social bond for all humans. For in other words, granted that because of their diversity sex bodies do not fit squarely within ideal gender, dimorphism in Lacanian discourse is nevertheless said to serve as an ideal, a measure by which one may separate normal from perverted sexuality, that reality can never match. 5. The basic fault in Butler's account, then, according to Vis-a-vis, lies in an interpretation that attributes to Lacan a binary determination of that he demonstrably does not adopt. 6. On the other hand, on Vis-a-vis reading, Derrida patently argues that one must think difference before reading difference here as a neutral free play of sexual arrangements that is inevitably betrayed by determinate. Vis-a-vis reads this as the illegitimate hypostatization of absolute difference, which is covertly the hypostatization of sameness. In his words, philosophers as different as Alan Badiou and Frederick Jameson have pointed out, regarding today's multiculturalist celebration of the diversity of lifestyles, how this thriving of differences relies on an underlying one, that is, on the radical obliteration of difference, of the antagonistic gap. The same goes for the standard postmodern critique of as a binary opposition to be deconstructed. There are not only two sexes, but a multitude of sexes and sexual identities in all of these cases. The moment we introduce thriving multitude, what we effectively assert is the exact opposite, underlying all pervasive sameness. 7. Vis-a-vis has good grounds for his objection to what he calls the standard postmodern critique of as a binary opposition to be deconstructed. However, the path through Derrida's reading of Heidegger in Gestschlicht conclusively demonstrates, thus, hopefully, justifying its tortuousness, that this standard postmodern critique does not suffice as a characterization of Derrida's operation. Vis-a-vis here attributes to Derrida a determination of difference, as free play, that he demonstrably does not adopt. Rather, for Derrida, difference connotes the difference that one may say, mimicking Vis-a-vis, is the traumatic cause that sets in motion the contingent proliferation of different sexual arrangements. In short, what I hope to have demonstrated by the end of this chapter is that both Derrida and Lacan deconstruct the presupposition that there is primordially a determinate characterization of, for example, binary, for the sarcasm of uncovering a more primordial kind of difference, allied with the traumatic real, for which and difference are synonymous nicknames. 238. This means, briefly, that is never actually present, since it has no intrinsic character, sense, or meaning. But because it occurs, it is therefore not present, and for this reason, it repeats as that which cannot be erased. It occurs, then, as that which both calls for interpretation and resists, eludes, exceeds, all interpretations, so rupturing the order of interpretation that the call for reinterpretation never ceases. Vis-a-vis sums it up neatly, far from serving as an implicit symbolic norm that reality can never match, as real / impossible means precisely that there is no such norm, is that bedrock of impossibility on account of which every formalization of fails. 8. Again, we should be as precise as possible here with regard to the relationship between trauma as real and the domain of socio-symbolic historical practices. The real is neither prosocial nor a social effect. Rather, the point is that the social itself is constituted by the exclusion of some traumatic real. What is outside the social is not some positive a priori symbolic form / norm, but merely its negative founding gesture itself. 9. Again, is not a firm set of static symbolic oppositions and inclusions / exclusions, heterosexual multiplicity that regulates homosexuality and other perversions to some secondary role, but the name of a deadlock, a trauma, an open question, something that resists every attempt at its symbolization. Every translation of into a set of symbolic opposition, is doomed to fail, and it is this very impossibility that opens up the terrain of the hegemonic struggle for what sexual difference will mean. 10. Again, the claim that the real is inherent to the symbolic is strictly equivalent to the claim that there is no big other. The Lacanian real is that traumatic bone in the throat that contaminates every ideality of the symbolic, rendering it contingent and inconsistent. 11. Well, yes, exactly. One need only replace as real / impossible in the first citation and in the others, some traumatic real, a deadlock, a trauma, an open question, the Lacanian real with difference, understood in its complexity, of course, or any number of its other nicknames, in order to have Vis-a-vis affirming precisely the Derridean conception of that emerges from Derrida's reading of Heidegger's thinking on the topic proposed in his essay Gestschlicht 12. Derrida reading Heidegger on Gestschlicht. Outline in Gestschlicht, Derrida argues that despite, or because of, a remarkable silence on the topic of, that aspect of Heidegger's thinking named by the ontological difference opens a way for rethinking the question of fundamentals concerning sexuality. He demonstrates that the 239 form of the question concerning that opens this chapter is, as always, misleading, because the complex answer given by an interrogation of Heidegger's silence, which has to do with the sense in which the ontological difference marks the difference between two irreducibly, quasi-transcendentally, interrelated kinds of, does not obey the either / or logic it presupposes. Notably, Derrida's primary aim in this avowedly preparatory text is to render the complexity and difficulty of Heidegger's thinking concerning sexuality so that he can commence a non-facile critique of it, which will follow the slow, painstaking rhythm of a lengthy seminar. 13. Despite the introductory character of this reading, however, the direction that his critique will take is indicated adequately enough for my purpose in this chapter, which is to show that the position on that emerges from his critique of Heidegger is compatible in structure with Lacan's treatment of this subject, despite the lexical or metaphorical diversity of their respective discourses. Derrida anchors his reading to 3 points of troubling silence in Heidegger's text, or, that is, 3 points of reduction in each of which there turns out to be more at issue than first meets the eye. While it is somewhat violent and reductive on my part to do so, since Derrida's text retains a complex interconnectedness that exceeds this heuristic, I have accordingly isolated 3 main thematic moments in his argument, which follows a course of increasing problematization and difficulty. In outline, I elaborate below. His reading first predominantly thematizes the sense of neutralization in Heidegger's thinking. The outcome of this initial analysis is a demonstration that, for Heidegger, the operation of neutralization does not desexualize Dasein. Rather, neutralization of binary at the ontic level reveals, as Dasein's naked trait, a sexuality defined as originary positivity. Neutralization, accordingly, also makes explicit what is meant by the ontological difference thought of, in terms whose resonance with presence and positivity will soon be problematized, as the difference between beings and being. Before moving on to address Derrida's analysis of the two related difficulties consequent upon Heidegger's conception of originary positivity, I have taken the liberty of injecting Lacan's correlative articulation of primordial, originary, narcissism. A Lacanian spectral analysis of narcissism offers clarifying and enriching terms for articulating the bare self-relation or Dasein's naked trait arrived at through neutralization, which adumbrates what Derrida will ultimately get to in his deconstruction of Heidegger's reduction of negativity. In the second moment of his argument in Gestschlicht, Derrida demonstrates that it would be a mistake to think that Heidegger reads originary positivity as a matter of pure presence. Rather, taking up Heidegger's 240 treatment of Dasein's ipsity, the ontic and ontological meanings of being the self, he shows that there is what he calls an originary disseminality in Dasein, a multiplication that stands as a condition of the possibility of multiplicity at the ontic level. There are many points of connection here with Lacanian discourse, but I have given particular attention to the match between Heidegger's ontological difference, now read as a difference between two kinds of difference, and Z is Eke's account of a zero institution where something like Heidegger's ontological difference operates in the Lacanian discourse on. I add the qualification something like because I think that the Lacanian discourse is in sympathy with the Derridean critique and modification that emerges from Derrida's reading of Heidegger here. While the terms may be slightly different, Derrida makes the same point as Z is Eke, namely, that signals difference as such, prior to signaling any determinate differences, for it becomes clear enough that originary disseminality can be read as a synonym for originary sexuality. The final section of Derrida's essay represents his deconstructive moment of critique. If he affirms Heidegger's stance to the extent that he resists determining positivity as pure presence, favoring instead a notion of originary disseminality, he nevertheless resists Heidegger's simultaneous attempt to eradicate negativity from both ontic and ontological levels. By doing so, Derrida argues, Heidegger excludes a conception of an economic, hysterical, Dasein, which he in fact requires for an account of corruption. This engenders an irreconcilable tension that can only be negotiated by means of a logic other than that of aletheia or economic circular return. One may conclude by suggesting that the other logic hinted at here takes the form of the plural logic of the agraria, which aims to formalize the traumatic condition of an originary relation of paradox between economic, paranoid, and an economic, hysterical, Dasein. While I have separated the following exposition into three parts, I have nevertheless tried as far as possible not to stray from the order of Derrida's argument. I hope that a certain amount of repetition will be compensated for by the fact that this makes for easier reference to Derrida's text. Neutralization and narcissism. First moment, neutralization to begin with. Derrida notes that Heidegger apparently said nothing about sexuality by name in those places where the best educated and endowed modernity would have fully expected it. 14 in the existential analytic of Dasein in Being and Time. 15 for example. It is true that one would 241 be hard put to find even the beginning of a discourse on desire and sexuality, and the same must be said of the deeper level analyses of the sense of being. 16 now, if sexuality does not appear to be, as Derrida puts it, the guiding thread for analyzing the existential and more fundamental ontological structures of Dasein, then the matter of Heidegger's silence seems settled. Heidegger allows himself to pass over in silence simply because he construes it as a secondary, determinate, ontic predicate, which may properly be abandoned to the life sciences, whereas, by contrast, his own thinking is directed toward the more fundamentally ontological question of the meaning and truth of a Dasein prior to all ontic predicates, which would therefore be sexually neutral, that is, a Dasein that would not be sexed. 17 Trusting Heidegger's manifest silence, one might find a number of grounds for objection, including, for example, the feminist point that a supposedly sexually neutral, non-sexual or desexualized, Dasein always ends up being covertly masculine. 18 But how prudent is it, Derrida asks, to trust Heidegger's silence? This cautionary note is sounded not in anticipation of finding some covert new Heideggerian text that would disturb the fact of this silence. Rather, readily admitting this fact, Derrida insists on the necessity of interrogating the places of silence in Heidegger's extant text. Chances are, he wagers, that Heidegger has in fact said quite a lot in the places where sex is not said. 19 In Derrida's assessment, the matter of Dasein's sexuality in fact remains profoundly unsettled and must have been so even for Heidegger, since he apparently immediately felt compelled to explain himself in a course given in 1928 in Marburg, where the title of Dasein, its sense as well as its name, acquired by decree in Being and Time, is more patiently qualified, explained. Evaluated 20 However, as Derrida points out, the nature of this elaboration is nothing if not curious. He underlines two statements whose juxtaposition attracts attention. 21 Here are the statements in question, as cited by him, for the being which constitutes the theme of this analytic. The title man, Mensch, has not been chosen, but the neutral title Dasein. 22 That neutrality means also, my emphasis, J.D. That Dasein is neither of the two sexes, Keynes von Baden Gestschlicht Ernest. 23 Heidegger first of all determines Dasein as neutral in the sense that, as Derrida explains, having subtracted every anthropological, ethical or metaphysical predetermination, its primary, naked trait is a bare self-relation, or self-awareness. According to Derrida, 242 this relation to self is not a relation to an ego or to an individual, of course. Thus Dasein designates the being that in a determined sense is not indifferent to its own essence, or to whom its own being is not indifferent. Neutrality, therefore, is first of all the neutralization of everything but the naked trait of this relation to self, of this interest for its own being, in the widest sense of the word interest. The latter implies an interest or a pre-comprehensive opening up to the sense of being and for the questions thus ordained. 24 I have cited Derrida at some length here because this observation concerning Dasein's naked trait immediately brings to mind the psychoanalytic notion of primary narcissism, and it is, inter alia, this link that supports the thesis of a match between Derridean and Lacanian discourses on sexual difference. In fact, to show that Lacanian discourse offers an illuminating elaboration of what Derrida calls the naked trait of this relation to self and describes in terms of Dasein's primordial interest for its own being, I shall take the liberty of interjecting a Lacanian spectral analysis of narcissism at the close of my exposition of the first moment of Derrida's reading. Moreover, I am convinced that the complexity of the Lacanian analysis here is ultimately confirmed by Derrida in Gestschlicht at the point of his deconstructive critique of Heidegger in the third moment of his argument. To return for now to the Marburg statements, what is remarkable enough in Heidegger's words to elicit Derrida's attention has to do with the second statement, whereby neutrality is explicitly made a matter of sexual neutrality. 25 There are, as the grammatical place of the also in this statement suggests, many traits besides the sexual, for example, race, age, nationality, that Heidegger could have listed as examples of determinations to be left out of the analytic of Dasein. Why, then, does he not only begin with sexuality but never get to any other examples? 26 If, in other words, one would be justified in thinking that he attaches some privilege to sexuality, how is this privilege to be understood? Of course, one could simply say that it makes a certain grammatical common sense for sexuality to come to mind first in the terminological transition from Mensch, indeed man, to Dasein, for one is here electing the neutral over and above the masculine. 27 But there is more to it than this, for as Derrida notes, neutrality also inscribes the notion of binarity, if Dasein is neutral, and if it is not man, Mensch. The first consequence to draw from this is that it does not submit to that binary partition one most spontaneously thinks of in such a case, to wit, If being there does 243 not mean man, Mensk, a 40 right designates neither man nor woman 28 in this case. Heidegger's prioritization of sexuality as the first trait to be neutralized might simply reflect the view that Dasein insofar as it is first concretized is concretized in terms of binary, man/woman. 29 Heidegger doesn't doubt that there are 230 here. Derrida gently begins to shift the terrain. If Dasein does not submit to a binary determination of, then, sexuality, as a binary opposition, is again placed firmly in the ontic domain. Having correctly seen that Heidegger's insistence on the asexuality of the ontological structures of Dasein has to do with the insight that the discriminative belonging to one or another sex inscribes a negativity, understood in the Hegelian sense of mutual negation associated with dialectical opposites, it still seems plausible at this point, although Derrida will soon show why this is misguided, to argue that the Heideggerian discourse, defining sexuality as fundamentally a binary opposition, disallows sexuality at the fundamental ontological level in favor of a neutral, read, non-sexual, Dasein. 31 To uncover what is amiss in this argument, Derrida begins by noting that the asexuality of Dasein as neither man nor woman is so nearly common sense that it hardly seems to justify the privileged attention Heidegger accords it here. After all, he had nothing to say of it in Being and Time, and, in fact, once he has made the point that Dasein is reducible neither to human being, nor to the ego, nor to consciousness, nor to the unconscious, nor to the subject, nor to the individual, nor even to an animal rationale, it is difficult not to think that the question of sexual difference is so obviously secondary to those of the sense of being and of the ontological difference that even its dismissal did not deserve privileged treatment. 32 Yet, as we have seen, precisely the opposite happens. Having proposed the neutrality of Dasein, Heidegger's attention is first focused on emphasizing its sexual neutrality or asexuality. Shouldn't this precautionary overemphasis, Derrida asks, raise our suspicion that reducing sexuality to the ontic realm, for Heidegger, is not a matter of course, for there is more at stake here than first meets the eye? For Derrida, the answer is affirmative. If binary clearly does not belong to the ontological structures of Dasein, yet Heidegger apparently takes a little too much trouble to reduce sexuality to the ontic level, then the difficulties are going to begin to accumulate. It is true, he argues, that in common parlance the terms neutrality and asexuality imply a certain negativity. Besides the negativity of the 244 neither / neither male nor female, there is also the stronger negativity of the not sexual. Yet, if one reads Heidegger's text seriously, one comes to see that such negativity manifestly runs counter to what Heidegger wishes to mark out in his use of these terms. In fact, albeit counterintuitively, it is by means of these negativities that one must be able to read what Heidegger does not hesitate to call a positivity, a richness, and even, in a heavily charged code, a power, marked Keat. In other words, where sexuality is neutralized by Heidegger, it will indeed have been a matter of negating binary at the ontological level and reducing it to the ontic level, as is commonly suspected. However, Dasein's sexuality as such is not thereby negated. What is annulled, instead, through neutralization, is only its binary, dual, determination, and this, in turn, has the effect of liberating a positivity in Dasein. This pre-dual sexuality, which, notably, is not thereby rendered unitary, homogeneous or undifferentiated, becomes the positive and powerful source of every sexuality. 33 At this point, Derrida outlines in schematic form the movement of the argument he will elaborate in the course of the essay. First, as binary does not constitute a positivity that neutralization would annul. Rather, it is precisely determined as binary that leads to negativity. This means, he adds, that neutralization has a double and contradictory sense. It is at once the effect of this negativity and the effacement to which thought must subject it to allow an original positivity to become manifest. 34 On the one hand, one may take Derrida's claim that neutralization is the effect of the negativity for which binary is responsible, to be an allusion to the feminist point, derived from Hegel, that binary is self-annulling, for, paradoxically, the determination of as a binary opposition surreptitiously erases in favor of masculine privilege, disguised as a neutral subject. 35 He elaborates this argument in Choreographies where he remarks that when is determined by opposition in the dialectical sense one appears to set off the war between the sexes, but one precipitates the end with victory going to the masculine sex. 36 One can link together, he notes, thus determined, 1 out of 2, negativity, and a certain impotence. 37 In Lacanian terms, this impotence is named by the lose of the mother's choice. However, on the other hand, Derrida continues, one must account for the loss, or impotence, which occurs with the division into two sexes, or, that is, for the fact that the binary does not exhaust the notion of sexuality. In other words, to argue that binary is basic would 245 mean that Dasein itself lacks in a double sense. It lacks internally because it is a priori divided by neither / or, which, moreover, covers all that is possible. Thus, it also lacks an excess or outside, for such a choice between mutually contradictory opposites assumes a closed totality. In this case, it is impossible to account for more than two sexual styles. The fact that there are more than two sexual styles, then, would then have to be explained away as perversions or accounted for by a different logic. To support a different logic, one requires the notion of an originary positivity, or in the later Derridian and Lacanian modifications respectively, originary dissemination or asexual libido, which is prior to, or in excess of, the binary division of masculine and feminine libido. Heidegger accounts for what exceeds the binary opposition by means of another sense of neutralization associated with the ontological difference. Briefly, his conception of the ontological difference names the difference between beings, taken in noun form, as concretized, embodied or phenomenal, and the being, taken in verb form, that underlies them. It also inscribes the necessity that what is named by the term being is forgotten, suspended, in the constitution of beings. The very fact that there are phenomenal beings, then, is a sign of the suspension of being, or, in other words, such determinate phenomena bear the trace of this suspension and consequently remain congenitally not all or lacking. To import useful terms from Lacanian discourse. 38 Accordingly, neutralization becomes the effacement to which thought must subject the not all, or negativity, brought about by binary determination of, in order to recover originary positivity and power. 39 Derrida adds that it is not, therefore, as if there is either binary or asexual neutrality, the two standing opposed. Rather, they are on the same side in the sense that asexual neutrality becomes the condition / power whose erasure / effacement / forgetting first makes the sexual binary possible. Thus asexual Dasein both calls for and exceeds phenomenal beings divided by the either / or of. Derrida emphasizes that the order of implication here is important. Originary positivity, at the ontological level, is a condition of the possibility of ontic difference rather than vice versa. This is important because it allows one to question the necessity of determining as dual. If sexuality can be understood as not yet sealed by a two at some point, can it be understood as no longer sealed by a two? One should tread carefully here, for Derrida indeed argues that it is necessary to start thinking of an ontological sexuality that is no longer two, but not, as is often thought, through the thematics of unregulated dispersal, but via the plural logic of the Aperia. 246 When Heidegger goes on to develop the motifs of neutrality, positivity, originary power, the originary itself, Derrida continues, he does so without direct reference to. 40 Perhaps his aims to preempt the kind of easy misunderstanding that would persist in interpreting Gestschlicht one-sidedly only in terms of the ontic system of binary. Nevertheless, Derrida insists on two important points. First, he notes that Heidegger's elaboration of the notion of neutralization prepares the ground for the more complex and nuanced understanding of the relations between binary and sexuality, Geschlecht and Geschlechtlichkeit, that he aims to draw out of Heidegger's text in an examination of dissemination and related notions. In other words, here he makes the argument that Heidegger's conception of the ontological difference names not only the difference between beings and being but also the difference between two kinds of difference. In this case, it is the kind of difference named by the term being, Dasein in its ontological temporalization, that is forgotten, suspended, in the constitution of the determinate systems of differences or ontic manifold to which beings belong. Correspondingly, then, Heidegger treats sexuality in terms of two kinds of difference, as a kind of originary dissemination that underlies determinate, here, binary. The fact that these two forms of difference are not contradictory opposites subject to an either / or logic but are on the same side, subject rather to a quasi-transcendental logic of implication, makes it equally impossible to reduce sexuality to the ontic level and to posit it as an ontological category. Second, he emphasizes Heidegger's insistence that neutralization has a sense that should not be understood as negative but as a means to return to the power of origin which bears within itself the internal possibility of humanity in its concrete factuality. The problematics associated with negativity will be thematised explicitly in the final stage of his argument. Derrida concludes this first stage of his analysis with the remark that for Heidegger, Dasein only exists in its factual concretion, to be sure, but this very existence has its originary source, Urkel, and its internal possibility in Dasein as neutral. 41 The analytic of Dasein, then, should not be confused with a discourse on sexuality that remains at the level of factual concretion. As Derrida puts it, a discourse on sexuality of this order, wisdom, knowledge, metaphysics, philosophy of life or of existence, falls short of every requirement of an analytic of Dasein in its very neutrality. He then poses an interesting question: has a discourse on sexuality ever come forward that did not belong to any of these registers? 42 Heidegger, albeit implicitly, came close to fashioning such a discourse. But it seems to me that his thinking requires the Derridean 247 modification to come in order for the answer to be affirmative. Moreover, as a Lacanian spectral analysis of narcissism should go some way to showing, the Lacanian discourse is an obvious candidate for an affirmative answer. A Lacanian spectral analysis of narcissism, it is easy enough to associate Dasein's primordial interest for its own being with the psychoanalytic notion of narcissism and, through its determination as self-love, with libido. Dasein's naked trait translated into psychoanalytic terms would be narcissistic libido. But, as Derrida notes, this relation to self is not a relation to an ego. This statement is clearly incompatible with the traditional Freudian notion of narcissistic libido, and to make the match one must take account of the Lacanian revision, whereby narcissism is submitted to a similar kind of spectral analysis as that to which Zizek submits the notion of the other in the Realov, as discussed in Chapter 3. For Freud, as previously noted, narcissism in the subject first emerges in tandem with the construction of an ideal ego, defined as love for the ego as a whole. The construction of a loved ideal ego occurs through the process of sublimation, here defined as the deflection of libido from the external Nebenmensch toward its internalized reflection, resulting in a primary narcissism expressed as childhood megalomania. In Lacanian terms, however, such ego love, which is associated with the metaphor of the mirror image, is not the most primordial kind of narcissism. Instead, childhood megalomania belongs to the imaginary order. Freud goes on to develop the notion of narcissism along with the shift from ideal ego to superego. In this shift, narcissism is rearticulated. It no longer characterizes my love for what I think I am but for my conception of what I ought to be. Narcissism, then, is here associated with a rearticulation of sublimation that takes it as a process of idealization and relates it inversely to altruism. This dimension of narcissism, or superego love, in Lacanian terms, belongs to the symbolic order. If Freud calls childhood megalomania a primary form of narcissism in relation to superego love and implies thereby that the self-relation begins as self-awareness, Lacan argues, to the contrary, that there is another, even more primary narcissism at the unconscious level of the traumatic real, for which the term soul love, borrowed from Seminar XX, is a sufficiently appropriate name. 43 It is this dimension of primordial narcissism that brings Lacan's account in line with Dasein's. Naked trait. Generally speaking, soul love may be understood as a synonym for libido. 248, defined, in its widest sense, as the expression of drive as such, which is the correlative of lack, or the originary finitude to which belongs a sense of expropriation. 44 For Lacan, further, there is no drive other than the death drive, that is, the drive toward a complete satisfaction that perpetually is not yet. Soul love, or primordial narcissism, names the love I experience for the retrospectively constructed illusion of my own being as one, or as the all my so construed and most being, toward which the death drive drives, is, and intrinsically remains, in excess of what I am. One could also call soul love my love for my own sublimity. As Lacan puts it, analysis demonstrates that love, in its essence, is narcissistic. It is but the desire to be 145. Notably, then, sublimation becomes something other than deflection of libido from its investment in sexual relations with others, to the narcissistic interest in self-improvement, measured in terms of the superego ideal. Instead, one may subject primordial narcissism, soul love, to its own further spectral analysis, which reveals, always retroactively or narcotic, that it is determined in terms that match any of three libidinal styles. For Lacan, like Heidegger, on Derrida's reading, primordial narcissism may also be named asexual libido. Asexual libido, as Fink is quick to point out, does not mean desexualized libido. This would be a contradiction in terms. 46 Fink remarks upon a possible, and useful, distinction between the terms asexual and asexual, which is elaborated by Culver-Heyer through a distinction between phallic sexuality and the other jouissance. 47 Asexual here does not mean asexual, not sexual or sexually neutral, but implies a sexuality, a libidinal interest, the other jouissance, that is not phallic, hence, not signified by the symbolic, or, one could say, a libidinal interest that is not yet subject to symbolic determinations, which predominantly take the idealized form of neat binary oppositions. Suzanne Bernard agrees that such a sexual libido is the non-symbolized libido that both masculine and feminine subjects lose with the advent of sexual being. She describes such libido as libido not yet marked by castration or the cut of 48. We are always already sex beings in the sense that we are beings with libidinal interest, or, that is, beings defined in terms of our original separation from, and therefore primordial interest in, jouissance. Primordial sexness does not suggest that sexuality is necessarily originally divided into masculine and feminine. It implies only a generalized, non-dual, libidinal interest in the restoration of the self as the all it supposedly once was, via a hypothesized path of return to the originary or an anticipated restitution of the all in the future. In other terms, primordial narcissism names the libidinal interest in the other jouissance or that 249 which, beyond phallic sexual pleasure, lies in the impossible domain of totality, infinity, or paradox, before it is retroactively, narcotic, cast in terms of any determinate division between masculine and feminine. In Lacan's words, as for being a being that would be posited as absolute, it is never anything but the fracture, break, or interruption of the formulation sex being insofar as sex being is involved. Interest, in jouissance 49 for Lacan, then, asexual libido names the soul's death drive, its all-consuming interest in restoring its own most sublimity, believed to be more primordial than, and prior to, its ontic determination as this or that being. Primordial narcissism, accordingly, is libido directed toward a supposedly primordial past that was, in fact, never present, since it represents either of two retrospectively constructed illusions of wholeness, totality or infinity, or the true traumatic state of paradox. Thus, when the sublime in me, the all toward which the drive drives, is understood as an ideal, soul love is retroactively determined according to two possible illusions, that of the all as a totality and that of the all as an infinity. When the sublime in me is recognized as the traumatic kernel of the real, soul love is retroactively determined according to the all as difference or the paradoxical truth that is no longer truth. It is only when subjects develop the tendency to rely upon characteristic libidinal styles that one can retroactively determine the character of their primordial narcissism in those who tend to experience boundaries as marking out the domain of security, beyond which they become anxious to the point of breakdown. One may detect an economic, paranoid libidinal style, derived from the retroactively constituted illusion that the all of their desire, that is, the past that was never present, was the closed circle of an all-encompassing unity. By contrast, in those who tend to experience boundaries as restrictive limitations to be resisted at all costs, even blindly, simply because they are there, one may detect an economic, hysterical libidinal style, derived from the retroactively constituted illusion that the all toward which they strive was the infinite flow of an oceanic nirvana. In those who are able to experience boundaries as permeable, everything simultaneously has its natural and imposed limits and remains potentially open to chance events, one may detect the paradoxical libidinal style, derived from the power to face the truth that the all toward which they strive remains a traumatic kernel. Self-knowledge is retroactive, on the basis of what is given in experience. One may say that the all must have been accorded the value of totality, economic interpretation, infinity, uneconomic interpretation, or its paradoxical modification. On the basis of such a spectral analysis it becomes much clearer how Lacanian discourse can accord with the plural logic of the a priori 250 which, as I hope to show, Derrida introduces into Heidegger's thinking on by way of critique. To my mind, the proposition of correlating a Heideggerian /Derridean discourse on sexuality, granting the Derridean modification still to be addressed, with an equivalent Lacanian discourse has begun to look substantially more plausible than it might have done at the start of this explication. The plausibility of this connection increases as one progresses further along the path of Derrida's reading. To trace out how this is so one must return patiently to Geschlecht and to Heidegger's qualification of Dasein's originary positivity which makes of it, in fact, an originary disseminality dissemination and the zero institution second moment, dissemination introducing a new stage in his argument. Derrida turns to a second place of silence in Heidegger's text, this time in the Muss und des Grunds, where Heidegger further develops the argument concerning neutralization as the reduction of Dasein to the bare self-relation. As Derrida puts it, it is a matter of determining the ipsity of Dasein, its self-theat or being a self 50. What Heidegger has in mind in this text is an ipsity starting from which certain differences become manifest, for example, those between egoism and altruism or between being I and being you, ich/du/Sinn. Neutral with respect to these determinations, Dasein is neutral, Heidegger adds, with all the more reason with regard to sexuality. Here, again, Derrida notes, where sexuality is named to be silenced, the logic of the a fortiori operation imposes itself, neutrality is insisted upon, and with all the more reason with regard to binary. Again, he asks, why insist? Where is the risk of misunderstanding? Unless the matter is not at all obvious, and there is still a risk of mixing up once more the question of with that of being and the ontological difference. 51 This a fortiori operation, as Derrida notes, implies presuppositions concerning sexuality similar to those outlined in relation to the Marburg statements. First, sexuality is assumed to be merely the sure predicate of whatever is made possible by or beginning with ipsity. Second, Heidegger implies that sexuality does not belong to the neutral power of asexuality, which characterizes the structure of an ipsity that is not as yet determined as human being, me or you, conscious or unconscious subject, man or woman in short. One again might mistakenly assume that Heidegger clearly reduces sexuality to the ontic level and insists that 251 must above all protect the analytic of Dasein from the risks of anthropology, of psychoanalysis, even of biology, i.e., from discourses that might insist on the fundamentality of binary sexuality. Again, on Derrida's reading, if Heidegger insists and underlines, with all the more reason, it is because a suspicion has not yet been banished. What if sexuality already marked the most originary self-theat? If it were an ontological structure of ipsity? If the there of Dasein were already sexual? What if were already marked in the opening up to the question of the sense of being and to the ontological difference? And what if neutralization, which does not happen all by itself, were a violent operation? 52 One should note that Derrida's text works rather like a palimpsest. In these questions, he opens the way to the new analysis that will thematize the link between originary sexuality and dissemination. He also repeats the concerns of the previous analysis of neutrality and hints at the concerns of the analysis of negativity to come. In relation to the current analysis, his question concerns whether here again, as in the previous analysis, there still may be a door open for other words, or another usage and another reading of the word Geschlecht if not the word sexuality. Tellingly, if one thinks of the Lacanian discourse of the other sexuality elaborated in Seminar XX, he adds, perhaps another sex or rather another Geschlecht will come to be inscribed within ipsity. 53 Here, the other words with which one may speak of the produal positivity and power returned to via neutralization in the previous analysis all belong to the very subtle differentiation of a certain lexicon which will bring with it translation problems that cannot be thought of as secondary or accidental in Derrida's words. The lexical hive brings together, or swarms, the series dissociation, distraction, dissemination, division, dispersion. Like neutrality, dissemination draws together opposing senses. The dis of this lexicon, already the figure of partitioning, also signals a partition within itself, for dis often has a negative sense, yet sometimes also a neutral or non-negative sense. 54 To begin this new analysis, Derrida lays out in advance what is at issue. Most importantly, at this point, he aims to show that the positivity to which one returns via neutralization indicates something other than pure presence. Further, the analysis here remains parallel to the previous one in which Derrida finds that for Heidegger, a produal, asexual positivity at the ontological level is the condition of the possibility of at the ontic level. Here, according to Derrida, Dasein in general hides 252 shelters in itself the internal possibility of a factual dispersion or dissemination in its own body and thereby in sexuality. 55 The order of implication remains crucial. The dispersing multiplicity is not due to sexual difference, rather, the flesh draws Dasein into the dispersion and in due course into sexuality. Finally, the dispersing multiplicity at the ontological level should not be understood in the negative sense of a fall or accident. Here again, it is not an either nor, but rather what is properly concrete in the origin, the not yet of factual dissemination, of dissociation, of being dissociated. 56 Derrida points out that the words prefixed by dis or do indeed have a negative resonance that is difficult to eradicate. He will return to this difficulty, but for now, something else is at issue here, namely, another meaning of multiplicity, a multiplication that is recognizable in the isolation and factual singularity of Dasein, which is neither a simple multiplicity or diversity nor a grand original being whose simplicity was suddenly dispersed but an originary manifold. For Heidegger, it is rather a matter of elucidating the internal possibility of that multiplication for which Dasein's own body represents an organizing factor. 57 In other words, for Heidegger it is a matter of elucidating the way in which being embodied is the place in which past, present, and future are gathered together. To put this in other terms, the being of Dasein in general is already characterized by an origin redissemination, temporal dispersion or disseminality, that is the condition of the possibility of dispersion, scattering, diffusion, dissipation, distraction, at the ontic level. According to Derrida, Heidegger uses the word Streuung once for such disseminality and thereafter, the word is always the Streuung. In an adumbration of his critique of Heidegger's thinking, he notes that using the latter term would add a mark of determination and negation, had not Heidegger warned us just a moment before against the value of negativity. Yet, even if not totally legitimate, it is hard to avoid a certain contamination by negativity, or, that is, an economic moment, indeed by ethico-religious associations that would link that dispersion to a fall or to a corruption of the pure originary possibility, Streuung, which appears thus to be affected by a supplementary turn. It will indeed be necessary to elucidate also the possibility or fatality of that contamination. We will return to this later. 58 Returning to his exposition and interpretation of Heidegger's text, Derrida offers some examples of what Heidegger might mean by an origin redispersion or disseminality. Pointing out that we never primarily look at 253 an isolated object but at a manifold of co-appearing beings, Heidegger argues that appearance is a manifold for us not because there is beforehand a plurality of objects. Actually it is the converse that takes place. 59 In other words, this multiplicity is made possible because, according to the Heideggerian version of Kant's productive imagination, Dasein is dispersed over the temporal modes of intuition, memory, and anticipation. It is also the case, Derrida argues, that Dasein's relation to itself is so dispersed, in the sense that Dasein occurs as a temporal spacing, which, prior to the determination of measured time or space as extentio, comes to extend or stretch out being there, the there of being. Between birth and death 60 Dasein is the suspension between the intervallic tension that gives birth and death their meaning. As Derrida puts it, the link thus intertwined, held or drawn in, over or through the distance between birth and death, maintains itself by dispersion, dissociation, unbinding the transcendental dispersion, as Heidegger still names it, thus belongs to the essence of Dasein in its neutrality. 61 Stated in reverse, transcendental dispersion or origin redissemination is the condition of the possibility of every dissociation and parceling out into factual existence. Further, transcendental dispersion itself is a matter of thrownness which, notably, becomes the precursor to Difference and Lacan's traumatic real. In Derrida's words, there is no dissemination that does not suppose such a throw. Thrown before all the modes of throwing that will later determine it, project, subject, object, abject, trajectory, dejection, throw that Dasein cannot make its own in a project, in the sense of throwing itself like a subject master of the throw. 62 The ontological difference in sum, does not name the difference between beings and being in any positive determination but in fact marks a fundamental distinction between different kinds of difference. 1. The specific, contingent systems of differences, often binary, that characterize beings at the ontic level and are derived from analyses offered by the various sciences of the already present, and 2. The temporal differentiation or dispersal of being, at the underlying ontological level, or, that is, the fact that being is essentially not one but differentiated and dispersed over the three ecstasies of time and must therefore be taken not as the ultimate noun nor as a thing, here, the ultimate already present, but as a verb that in principle exceeds all determination. This temporal differentiation allows Heidegger to construe being as the originary power of making present. Heidegger's conception of being, then, carries with it connotations of potency and creative force reminiscent of Nietzsche's will to power. 254 Bearing in mind that the disseminal throw of being there includes the fact that Dasein is always already mid-sane, being with, it is at this point Derrida argues, that the theme of can reappear as always. Heidegger specifies an order of implication. For him, you cannot explain being with, the disseminal throw, starting from a being originally divided by, or, that is, belonging to a genre, or as a consequence of any generic organization or from the community of living beings as such. 63 In contrast to this, Heidegger insists that belonging to a genre, and the union of genres, sexual union or love, presupposes the dissemination of Dasein as such, and thereby mid-sane yet again. The order of presupposition matters, for it shows that Heidegger's aim is by no means to distance sexuality from every originary structure. 64 Rather, as Derrida points out, neutralization, negativity, dispersion, and distraction are, if we follow Heidegger, indispensable motifs for posing the question of sexuality. 65 Moreover, this is so even though sexuality is not named in being and time, where these motifs are treated in a complex, differentiated fashion. Zedizek and the Zero Institution. To conclude this section, I turn to Zedizek's account of the way in which something like Heidegger's ontological difference, or, that is, the difference between two kinds of difference, operates in the Lacanian discourse on. 66 Again, this account adumbrates what Derrida will get to by the end of Gestschlicht, namely that origin redissemination, for which another name might just as well be origin resexuality, or lamella, cannot be understood in purely economic terms but must be understood as traumatic. In answer to the question of how to understand as the name of a deadlock, a trauma, an open question, Zedizek draws an analogy to Claude Lévi-Strauss' notion of the Zero Institution. Analyzing one of the Great Lakes tribes, Lévi-Strauss discovered that an individual's understanding of the ground plan of their village was determined by his or her attachment to one or the other of the two subgroups that divided the tribe. As Zedizek explains it, both groups perceive the village as a circle. For one subgroup, however, there is within this circle another circle of central houses, so that we have two concentric circles, while for the other subgroup, the circle is split into two by a clear dividing line. 67 Zedizek names the first subgroup, in which the village is seen as disposed symmetrically around the central temple, conservative corporatist, and 255 the second, for obvious reasons, revolutionary antagonistic. 68 According to Zedizek, Lévi-Strauss goes on to argue that the very splitting into the two relative perceptions implies a hidden reference to a constant. 69 This constant, Zedizek adds, is not something objectively present but rather a traumatic kernel, a fundamental antagonism the inhabitants of the village were unable to symbolize, account for, internalize or come to terms with, an imbalance in social relations that prevented the community from stabilizing in a harmonious whole. 70 Interestingly, then, as Zedizek reminds one, the real here is not the actual arrangement of houses in the village, but the traumatic core of the social antagonism that distorts the tribe members' view of the actual antagonism. The real is thus the disavowed X on account of which our vision of reality is anamorphically distorted. 71 According to Zedizek, Lévi-Strauss makes a further crucial point here, since the two subgroups nonetheless form one and the same tribe, living in the same village. This identity has to be symbolically inscribed somehow. Such identity is made possible through what Lévi-Strauss ingeniously calls the Zero Institution, a kind of institutional counterpart to man of the empty signifier with no determinate meaning, since it signifies only the presence of meaning as such, in opposition to its absence. This Zero Institution has no positive, determinate function. Its only function is a purely negative one of signaling the presence and actuality of social institution as such in opposition to its absence, that is, in opposition to prosocial chaos. 72 Like the modern notion of the nation, or, for that matter, the way of community echoed in the word Gestschlicht, Zedizek notes, it is the reference to such a Zero Institution that enables all members of the tribe to experience themselves as members of the same tribe. 73 Is it necessary, he asks, to add that things are exactly the same with respect to sexual difference? As he elaborates, what if is ultimately a kind of Zero Institution of the social split of humankind, the naturalized, minimal zero difference, a split that, prior to signaling any determinate social difference, signals this difference as such. The struggle for hegemony would then, once again, be the struggle for how this zero difference is overdetermined by other particular social differences. 74 Third moment. Heidegger's reduction of the negative in the final part of his reading. Derrida explicitly takes up the theme of negativity that has already persistently haunted it. For Heidegger, he points 256 out, neutralization is related to the notion of privative interpretation or subtraction, by way of which fundamental a priori structures are uncovered. According to Heidegger, for example, the mode of being of the living requires a privative interpretation, since life is neither pure vorhanden and sane nor a Dasein. 75 It is accessible only by a negative operation of subtraction, subtract away all, until what remains is nothing but life, which is neither this nor that. Yet, as Derrida notes, this whole analytic organization is problematic. In his words, Heidegger never elaborated that ontology of life, but one can imagine all the difficulties it would have run into, since the neither nor that conditions it excludes or overflows the basic structural, categorial or existential, concepts of the whole existential analytic. 76 In other words, what Heidegger posits here is the notion of something along the lines of Lacan's traumatic real, that can only be approached, like God, through the secular equivalent of a negative theology. Yet, at the same time, his thinking is organized around the attempt to subject positive forms of knowledge to regional ontologies, and these to a fundamental ontology, which itself at that time was preliminarily opened up by the existential analytic of Dasein. 77 In short, Derrida detects a tension in Heidegger's thinking between negative and positive moments, or, that is, between a side that points in the direction of difference and a side that retains the character of any traditional metaphysics of presence. Further, Derrida argues that precisely the same tension between negativity and positivity has asserted itself so far in what he has drawn out of Heidegger's text concerning sexuality, and Heidegger's way of privation or neutralization involves the negation or subtraction of everything inessential until one is left with nothing but the bare or naked trait, which is neither this nor that. Notably, this is another way of saying that, through neutralization or subtraction, one arrives at a traumatic kernel. Thus, while one can never capture the naked trait in a positive determination, it is, nevertheless, not negative, it is instead an originary positivity, even if it is moreover not a unity but an originary dissemination. Why, Derrida asks, do negative determinations impose themselves so often within this ontological characteristic? Not at all by chance, he insists. Why must one proceed by way of privation or subtraction? Heidegger, like Nietzsche, acknowledges the necessary forgetting of being in order for beings to appear. The underlying being as presencing, as a verb, must be forgotten or repressed for beings, understood as entities occurring in time, or what is present at an ontic level, to be at all. All beings, then, no matter what kind, are only constituted on the basis of forgetting being. Being is necessarily occluded in beings. Further, for 257 Heidegger, again like Nietzsche, phenomena are emptied out, dissembled, disfigured, displaced, or covered over, in the necessary evil of their communication across borders and generations. The negative effects of merely passing ideas along and taking them over without thinking must in turn be annulled, and the originality of the phenomena recovered by negative statements whose true sense is supposedly positive, but, as Derrida points out, the negativity of the characteristic, neither this nor that, is therefore not any more fortuitous than the necessity of alterations or dissemblances which it attempts in some manner methodically to correct, that is, these dissemblances cannot be avoided, like contingent faults, any more than one can reduce inauthenticity to a fault or a sin into which one should not have fallen. 78 In other words, negativity is essential for Heidegger at both ontological and ontic levels. Curiously, however, Heidegger very seldom uses negativity to qualify the very thing that requires correction through subtraction or neutralization, as Derrida notes, inauthenticity, displacement, and covering over, are not of the order of negativity, the order of the false or of evil, of error, or of sin. By the same token, he notes that no negative signification is ontologically attached to the neuter in general, particularly not to this transcendental dispersion of Dasein. 79 Supposedly, then, for Heidegger, without attaching a negative value to either one of these registers, one must only take note of the hierarchical order that characterizes their relation. At this point, Derrida cautions that it becomes difficult for Heidegger to sustain this reduction of negativity. First, in certain contexts, dispersion marks the most general structure of Dasein. Then again, yet elsewhere, dispersion and distraction characterize the inauthentic ipsity of Dasein, that of man selbst, of that one which has been distinguished from the authentic and proper ipsity. 80 Moreover, pointing for instance to his analysis of Heidegger's attempts to situate Trakl in Gestschlick 2, he argues that Heidegger cannot avoid speaking of the decomposition and the essentialization, that is to say also a certain corruption, of the figure of man. 81 Derrida's remarks concerning these difficulties serve the purpose of opening up a space for a conception of negativity and corruption, an economy, that is not reduced away to the economic positivities. This again adumbrates and hints at the direction of his ultimate critique of Heidegger. Concluding remarks, the Derridean modification. To sum up, what one gains from Heidegger in answer to the question posed at the outset is a complex account of two different kinds of 258 difference between which it is always a question of the order of implications that Heidegger wants to preserve. 82 Does this answer enable us to construct a discourse on sexuality beyond the Hegelian motif of negation that depends on us too? In answer to this, for Derrida, the first thing that Heidegger demonstrates is that sexuality is not a predicate but gains its sense from the general structures of Dasein. Indeed, what would a sexual discourse or a discourse on sexuality be that did not evoke farness, the inside and the outside, dispersion and proximity, the here and the there, birth and death, the between birth and death, being with and discourse. 83 Second, Heidegger's insistence upon a specific order of implications opens up thinking to that would not yet be sexual duality, difference as dual. As we have already observed, what the cause neutralized was less sexuality itself than the generic Markov, belonging to one of two sexes. Hence, in leading back to dispersion and multiplication, may one not begin to think without negativity, let us clarify, not sealed by two. Not yet sealed or no longer sealed. 84 Derrida acknowledges that there is no thinking of difference without accepting Heidegger's conception of the ontological difference, that is, the division between two kinds of difference, which may also be read as the division between originary disseminality and any determinate division at the ontic level. His persistently Nietzschean disagreement with Heidegger concerns Heidegger's tendency to tie both originary disseminality and factical dissemination up in the logic of an economic circle, via reduction of negativity that one may also name the movement of aletheia. For Derrida, this move simply does not leave him the theoretical room at any level that he nevertheless requires for an account of corruption, or, as Derrida might put it, an economic or entropic waste. Even Plato, in the Timaeus, noticed the question of errance in human life or in the phenomenal world that cannot be explained away and must therefore be accounted for. Nothing is ever quite perfect, complete, economical, efficient, or predictable. Inevitably, of necessity, there is a bastard cause, a chance event, that creeps in to surprise or upset the best possible economies. For Derrida, this opening to chance events, to the aleatory, is a relief, a good thing, for economy at its most efficient involves a profoundly dangerous aporia. This is not to say that one must refuse economy its chance, for an economy at its extreme is an equally dangerous aporia. 259 I should immediately add that Derrida does not follow Nietzsche all the way, at least as Nietzsche is often understood. It is not that the economic circle of aletheia is entirely erased in his thinking, it is just persistently and equally originally undermined by an ineradicable, uneconomic moment. In other words, the originary is not just dispersed over three ceased of time and tied together in an economic circle. There is always also an economic moment of dispersion, or shattering, a kind of entropic dissipation or disassociation that opens up the space for the aleatory. Derrida, in short, replaces both Heidegger's circular economy and Nietzsche's economic fictionalization with the aporetic oscillation between the two that he names difference and characterizes in terms of the plural logic of the aporia for Derrida. Then, at the ontological level, difference occurs as both economic temporalization, paranoid deferral for the Sake of a proper return, and an economic spacing, a hysterical obsession with the impossibility of any proper return. The aporia of the aporias reflects the impossibility of reducing away either of these two impossibilities and the necessity of negotiating their mutual contamination. In the end, then, if Derrida dreams of a proliferation of sexualities, the binary and everything in between, it is only because, like Lacan, he insists on a more fundamental traumatic difference, disseminality, whose repression stands as the condition of the possibility for such diversity. I shall close my reading of Geschlecht by citing the following remark, in which one cannot but hear the Lacanian echoes. The withdrawal of the did leads towards the other. 85. One may formalize a way of thinking otherwise about the other by means of three styles associated with the plural logic of the aporia in the chapter to follow, which acts as a precursor to the Lacanian equivalent that will be explicated in more detail in part 4. I shall take up Derrida's description, in Spurs, of the three women that both characterize and horrify Nietzsche.